In 1386, in the Norman town of Falaise, a pig got into a house and killed a baby, tearing up the child's face and arm while it was at it. The town did not respond the way most people would expect. The pig was arrested, and it was put on trial the same way a person would have been, with a formal charge and professional lawyers and all the procedure that went with it, and the court found it guilty. Before they hanged the pig, they mutilated its face and its arm the same way it had mutilated the child, so the punishment matched the crime piece for piece. The execution happened in public, with trained executioners doing the work and a crowd standing around to watch, and afterward somebody painted the whole scene on the wall of the local church, where it stayed for people to look at for generations. Cases like this kept happening. Historians have documented hundreds of animal trials across medieval Europe, and in some of them the animal got a defense lawyer, same as a person would. This video is an hour of facts like that, pulled from the stretch of time historians usually mark out as running from around 476 to around 1500. It starts with the courts that put animals in front of a judge, and along the way it covers Mansa Musa giving away so much gold he wrecked a currency, a pope who put his dead predecessor's corpse on trial, and the day the whole period is usually said to have ended, when a Hungarian engineer's cannon brought down the walls of Constantinople. Now, let's get into the rest of these trials. The earliest case some historians point to came in 1226 in a town called Fontenay-aux-Roses, where a pig was burned alive for killing an infant, and the date itself is disputed, so it's worth calling it a starting point rather than a fact. In 1379, in Saint Marcel-Jussy, 2 herds of pigs were found to have rioted and to have helped kill a child, and the specific pigs that had done the killing were executed, while the 2 herds that were only involved got pardoned after the Duke of Burgundy stepped in. In 1492, in Abbeville, a piglet was dragged through the streets and then hanged by its hind legs for killing a child. An inventory of cases from the 13th through the 16th centuries counts 15 pigs executed for killing children, and pigs show up again and again because pigs lived right in among people and were dangerous to small children, while wolves and bears were never put on trial at all, because these trials were only for animals that lived alongside humans, or that got into church business as pests. One of the stranger cases came out of Basel in 1474, when a rooster was burned in front of a large crowd for what the charge called the crime of laying an egg, because the town believed the egg would hatch into a cockatrice. The explanation is simpler than the fear was. Hens can sometimes grow male-looking plumage because of tumors or disease, and that's almost certainly what the town in Basel had on its hands. Church courts went after the small stuff too, and it's the funnier half of this whole topic. Caterpillars, flies, moles, worms, snails, and leeches all got summoned, tried, and asked politely or formally to leave. A 10th century Byzantine writer named Kassionos Bassos left behind a recipe for evicting field mice, and it was written as a letter addressed to the mice themselves. I adjure you, O mice, who dwell here, not to injure me yourselves, nor to permit any other mouse to do so, and I make over to you this field. But should I find you staying here after having been warned, with the help of the Mother of the Gods, I will cut you in 7 pieces. The best single case in this whole topic belongs to a jurist named Bartholomé Chasseneuil, who defended the rats of Autun after they failed to show up to a summons, winning them an extension by arguing that the rats were scattered across a wide area and reasonably afraid for their lives if they traveled to court in a group. He used the same defense later for a colony of woodworms in Mamerol. Chasseneuil lived from 1480 to 1542, so this case sits right at the edge of the period, but it's too good to leave out. And then there was trial by ordeal, which worked on a different idea entirely, that God would step in and reveal guilt or innocence directly. In cold water ordeals, an accused person was submerged, and floating meant guilty, while sinking meant innocent. And the idea goes back to the Code of Ur-Nammu and the Code of Hammurabi, long before the medieval period even started. Louis the Pious banned it under Salic law in 829, and then it came back anyway, because a set of forest laws from 1338 describe a man accused of poaching being submerged in a barrel 3 separate times to settle the question. In the ordeal by cross, an accuser and the accused stood on either side of a cross with their arms held out to the sides, and whoever lowered their arms first lost the case. And Charlemagne prescribed this one twice, in 779 and again in 806, before Louis the Pious banned it in 819 because it was starting to look like mockery of Christ. And in the ordeal by ingestion, the accused ate dry bread and cheese that a priest had blessed, and choking on it counted as guilt. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council forbade clergy from taking part in ordeals, and Pope Innocent III banned priests from blessing the ordeal beforehand. And it's tempting to call that the day trial by ordeal ended, but that's too clean a version. What happened instead is that the ban worked as a call to action for secular courts to find another way, and the shift to a system called compurgation, where a person cleared their name with the sworn word of others, took centuries to spread everywhere. Trial by combat lasted even longer on paper. The last certain judicial duel fought in Britain happened in Scotland in 1597, when a man named Adam Brunfield accused James Carmichael of murder and killed him in the fight to settle it. And the right to demand one stayed on the books until a case called Ashford versus Thornton in 1818, where the judge pointed out how strange it was that a man bringing a legal case had to be willing to risk his own life to win it. Parliament finally abolished trial by combat in February of 1819, which puts the end of a medieval legal custom well into the age of steam engines. Now, let's move to the medieval things that got invented centuries later. A lot of what people think they know about the Middle Ages was invented long after it ended, and the flat earth is the clearest case of it. No educated person in medieval Europe believed the earth was flat, and the story that they did comes from 3 specific sources with names and dates attached. Washington Irving wrote a highly romanticized biography of Columbus in 1828 that a lot of readers mistook for real scholarship, and then John William Draper published a book in 1874 called History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science, and Andrew Dixon White followed in 1896 with a history of the warfare of science with theology in Christendom. Draper and White were pushing the idea that science and religion had always been locked in a war with each other, and one modern assessment of their work put it plainly: they had spread more fantasy than fact. That metaphor of permanent warfare between faith and reason is what carried the flat earth into everyday belief, and it's a 19th century invention wearing a medieval costume. Drot goed, senor, gets repeated just as often. The claim that a lord had a legal right to a bride on her wedding night before the husband did. There is no evidence that this reflected how things worked in the Middle Ages, and it never existed at all in England. Bathing is another one people get backwards. Public bathhouses were a normal part of medieval life, and the strongest evidence for it comes out of the Islamic world, where hammams operated across the Middle East, North Africa, Spain, and Central Asia, going back as far as the Umayyad period in the 7th and 8th centuries, inherited from the old Roman bathhouses and still central to daily life hundreds of years later. One traveler from the period described bathhouses heated with coal, which he said he had never seen done anywhere in Europe. None of that makes the period some kind of golden age, because serfdom was real, and millions of people spent their whole lives legally bound to land they didn't own and couldn't leave. The myths worth busting here are specific ones: a made-up biography, a made-up warfare theory, and a right that never existed on the books, and the unfreedom underneath all of it was no myth at all. Now, let's take a look at what plate armor actually weighed. A full suit of field armor weighed somewhere between 15 and 25 kilograms, or about 33 to 55 pounds, and that weight was spread across the whole body instead of hanging off the shoulders, which puts it around what a modern infantryman carries into the field. The old image of a knight needing a crane to get up onto his horse does not survive that number. That's the armor people picture in their heads though, and it belonged to the tournament field, where a knight only needed to survive one pass down a narrow lane. An armor built for that purpose could run up to 50 kilograms, or 110 pounds. Jousting armor didn't need to allow free movement, because it wasn't built for open combat, so the only real limit on how heavy it could get was how much weight the horse underneath it could carry. The heavy armor people picture in their heads belonged to the tournament field, and war never saw it. Knights also left behind instruction manuals for fighting in this armor, and those manuals survive. The earliest one is a text known as MSI 33, sometimes called the Towervechtbuch, and it teaches sword and buckler fighting with a method that is noticeably different from almost everything written after it. After that comes the tradition built around a teacher named Lichtenauer, whose verse instructions are still being translated, argued over, and physically tested by fencers today, with masters like Talhofer and Paulus Kahl teaching the same system. This was a technical discipline with its own literature and its own arguments, and it had nothing to do with swinging heavy metal around at random. Tournaments themselves are often pictured as one knight jousting another, but the older and more dangerous version was the melee, where large groups of knights fought each other all at once with swords, maces, and shields, all of it in full armor. The single joust came later, and it was the tidied up version of something that used to be closer to open warfare. Now, let's move to a few quick facts about the Vikings. Viking Age texts talk about helmets all the time, and not one of them ever mentions horns on those helmets. The idea that Vikings wore horned helmets is a modern one that started in the 1800s and got popular through Richard Wagner's operas about Norse myth, which put horns and wings on the helmets for the stage. Horns do not make sense on a helmet meant for fighting, and in the few places in history where horned headgear did exist, it was ceremonial or religious rather than something worn into combat. On the other hand, the Vikings did build something that still gets called the oldest surviving parliament in the world, the Icelandic Althing, where 39 chieftains called Godar and 9 others sat as voting members of a law council, and people gathered once a year to bring their cases, argue the law, and hear judgments, with smaller spring assemblies held locally underneath it. The English word thing traces back to this same root, so an old word for an assembly of people turned, over time, into the ordinary word for an object. And then there was the bill, because raiding was not free for the people getting raided. Danegeld was protection money paid out in silver by weight, and the first large English payment came in 991, right after the Viking victory at the Battle of Maldon, when King Ethelred was advised by the Archbishop of Canterbury to buy the raiders off instead of continuing to fight them. The payments only grew larger over the following decades, because paying once just told everyone that paying worked. Now, let's take a look at what was actually on a medieval dinner table. For most Christians in medieval Europe, meat was forbidden for something like a third of the year, and that single rule reshaped the whole kitchen, because people had to build an entire food culture around getting around it. The best loophole they found was reclassifying animals as fish. Beaver counted as fish, on the argument that it had a scaly tail and spent so much time in water, and the barnacle goose counted as fish too, because people believed it grew inside barnacles underwater instead of hatching from an egg, and there's a record of one being served at a fish day dinner in 1456. Two land animals got reclassified through pure argument so people could keep eating them on the days they weren't supposed to eat meat. Ale was everywhere, and people drank something like 275 to 300 liters of it a year per person. Weak beer with breakfast and stronger drinks later in the day, and the institutional numbers make it concrete. Framlingham Castle went through 78 gallons of ale a day in the winter of 1385 into 1386, and households handed out multiple gallons a day per person, right alongside the bread ration. Spices moved in serious volume too, with around 1,000 tons of pepper and another 1,000 tons of other common spices imported into Western Europe every year by the late Middle Ages. And pepper itself got hoarded, traded, and given away in public, the same way people treated gold bullion. Saffron sat above all of it as the truly exclusive spice, valued as much for its color as its taste, because under the medical theory of the time, yellow stood for qualities that were considered hot and prized, and turmeric got used as the cheap stand-in when saffron was out of reach. At a banquet Cardinal Riario threw for Eleanor of Naples in June of 1473, the bread on the table was gilded with gold, serving the meal and the medicine of the time at once. And one detail is easy to miss. There were no potatoes, no tomatoes, no corn, and no chili peppers anywhere in Europe before 1492. So a medieval table was missing the ingredients most people today would call the basics. Now let's move to the books and what people drew in the margins. The word scriptorium gets used constantly, and it oversells what happened, because only some monasteries had a dedicated room set aside for copying books, and monks often just worked wherever they had space, in the library or in their own quarters. By the later Middle Ages, secular workshops were doing most of the copying anyway, and a lot of monasteries bought more books than they ever produced themselves. The best idea to come out of this whole topic is the palimpsest. Parchment was made from lamb, calf, or goat skin, and it was expensive and hard to come by, so old pages got scraped clean and written over with something new. The word itself comes from a Greek phrase meaning scraped again, and every one of these reused pages is a deleted book sitting underneath a surviving one. Marginalia matters for a better reason than the funny doodles people usually bring up. Writers who left notes in the margins often had access to other texts that have since been lost completely, so a scribble in the margin can preserve a clue about a version of a work nobody has any other copy of, and the note ends up outliving the book it was quoting. The Book of Kells stands as the showpiece of the whole tradition, made around the year 800 in a monastery connected to St. Columba, likely with contributions from related houses in Scotland and Ireland, built around the four Gospels drawn mostly from the Vulgate translation, with some passages pulled from the older Vetus Latina text, and decorated more richly than any other insular Gospel book that survives. It gets its name from the Abbey of Kells in County Meath, where it stayed for centuries. Now, let's take a look at the riot that killed 63 students over bad wine. On February 10th, 1355, the feast day of Saint Scholastica, 2 Oxford students complained about the wine at the Swindlestock Tavern near Carfax. They argued with the man running the tavern, and the argument turned into blows, and other drinkers jumped in on both sides, and what started as a bar fight turned into a riot that ran for 3 days straight, with armed groups coming in from the countryside to help the townspeople against the students. Student halls were broken into, and the people inside were killed, and there were reports of scholars being scalped in the street. By the time it ended, around 20 townspeople were dead, and as many as 63 members of the university, and all of it started over the quality of a drink. This was not the university's first run-in with the town around it either, because violent clashes between students and townspeople had already happened more than once before, So the wine riot was less a freak event and more the worst version yet of a fight that kept happening. Universities themselves started as something narrower than a campus, because the word universitas originally meant just the guild, the corporation of students and teachers, not a physical place at all. Bologna was teaching students from around 1088 and had organized by the late 12th century into a guild run by the students themselves, which is the detail worth remembering, because at Bologna the students were the ones in charge of the corporation. Paris grew out of a cathedral school around 1150, got a charter from King Philip II in 1200, and was formally recognized by Pope Innocent III in 1215, and it's the school that gave the world the doctoral degree, along with the idea of organizing students into nations. Bologna also produced Betticia Gozzadini, the first woman on record to earn a university degree and to teach at a university, and that fact needs nothing added to it. And the Goliards closed this one out. Young clergy attached to the universities of France, Germany, Spain, Italy, and England in the 12th and 13th centuries who wrote satirical poetry in Latin about the contradictions they saw inside the church, often performing it during festivals built around exactly that kind of role reversal. Nobody is fully sure where the name comes from, whether it's from a word for gluttony, a made-up bishop named after Goliath, or a French word for someone reckless and carefree, but a historian named Christopher de Hamel described them well, people beyond the edge of society. Now, let's move to how you actually got into a castle. The trebuchet has a better story behind it than the machine itself. The earliest version, swung by a team of people pulling on ropes, showed up in China as far back as the 4th century BC, and it spread west, possibly through the Avars, until Byzantine, Persian, and Arab armies were using it by the 6th and 7th centuries. The counterweight version, which used a heavyweight instead of people to do the swinging, appeared around the Mediterranean in Christian and Muslim territory in the 12th century, and then the Mongols carried it all the way back to China in the 13th century, where it got called the Hui Hui Pao, the Muslim trebuchet. A weapon left China, got rebuilt on the other side of the world, and came home 400 years later under a foreign name. Mining was the real way to bring down a wall, and it worked by digging a tunnel under the fortification, holding it up with wooden props while the tunnel advanced, and then packing the excavation with anything that would burn and setting it on fire. The props burned away, the tunnel collapsed, and the wall above it came down because there was nothing left holding it up. Sappers used these same tunnels for more than demolition too, slipping through them into enemy territory to ambush, to counterattack, or to move troops from one part of a battlefield to another without being seen. Crac des Chevaliers shows how well this worked. The Mamluk Sultan Baybars undermined a tower in the castle's southwest corner, brought it down, and pushed his army in through the gap, and one of the strongest fortresses ever built fell from underneath. Chateau Gaillard, Richard I's castle, went through a siege from September of 1203 to March of 1204, and it fell to Philip II of France after the main tower was undermined the same way. And Philip did something that cuts against the ending most people would expect. He ordered that the survivors be fed and released. Now, let's take a look at money that moved without anyone carrying it. The Knights Templar built something close to a traveler's check centuries before banks did. A pilgrim could deposit valuables at a local Templar house before setting out, get a document recording the value, and then present that same document on arrival in the Holy Land to draw out the equivalent amount. It protected pilgrims from getting robbed on the road, and it made the Templars rich, because they built a network of close to 1,000 commanderies and fortifications spread across Europe and the Holy Land. The order people remember as knights was, underneath it, a bank that happened to also have castles. The Medici picked up where that left off, and their lasting contribution was the double entry system for tracking debits and credits in a general ledger, more than the money itself. Giovanni de' Medici founded the bank in Florence, and his son Cosimo the Elder took over as its head in 1434, and the family ended up running Florence in everything but name within a single generation, going from bookkeeping straight to governing a republic. Marco Polo closes out this stop, and the way his book came to exist is the best part of the story. He spent 17 years in the service of Kublai Khan, sent on missions as far as Myanmar, India, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, and Vietnam, and after all that he ended up in prison, where he dictated his entire account to a cellmate named Rusticello da Pisa. The most famous travel book to come out of the Middle Ages was written inside a jail cell by two men with nothing else to do. Now, let's move to the words you use every day that came out of Baghdad. A Persian scholar named Al-Khwarizmi worked at the House of Wisdom in Baghdad around the year 820, and his treatise, compiled between 813 and 833, gave the first systematic method for solving linear and quadratic equations, including a geometric way of solving quadratics by completing the square. He was the first person to treat algebra as its own independent subject, rather than a tool tucked inside something else. And this is where the payoff sits. The title of his treatise was Al-Jabr, and that word is exactly where algebra comes from. His own name gave English the words algorithm and algorithm, and it gave Spanish and Portuguese their words for a digit. Every time anyone today says the algorithm, they're saying the name of a 9th century Persian mathematician. His textbook on Indian arithmetic, once it got translated into Latin in the 12th century, is also what carried the decimal number system west into Europe. Al-Zahrawi is the second name worth knowing here, and most people have never heard it. He was born near Cordoba around the year 936, and his medical encyclopedia ran to 30 volumes, with a section on surgery that got translated into Latin and became the standard textbook across Europe for the next 500 years. He pioneered the use of catgut for internal stitches. He was the first person to identify hemophilia as something hereditary. He was the first to describe an abdominal pregnancy, and he developed surgical instruments for cesarean sections and cataract surgery, some of which are still used in something close to their original form. Ibn Battuta closes this one with a number that speaks for itself. He spent 30 years on the road, from 1325 to 1354, traveling across Africa, Asia, and Iberia, and he dictated his account, called the Rayla, near the end of his life. His total travel distance comes out to around 117,000 kilometers, or roughly 73,000 miles, compared with about 50,000 kilometers for the explorer Zheng He, and about 24,000 kilometers for Marco Polo, which means Ibn Battuta covered nearly 5 times the ground Marco Polo did. Now, let's take a look at the pilgrimage that broke a currency. Mansa Musa set out on his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 with an enormous group of travelers and an enormous supply of gold, and he gave that gold away the whole way there in the cities he passed through, including Cairo and Medina, reportedly building a new mosque every single Friday along the route. The trip ran from 1324 to 1326 and covered around 2,700 miles. What he spent in Egypt moved the Egyptian economy, driving inflation up and the value of gold down there for years afterward. One man's travel spending was enough to shake a national economy. Musa gets called the richest person who ever lived constantly, and that claim deserves a correction because it's a better story than the myth. A historian named Hadrian Collet has argued that Musa's wealth simply cannot be calculated with any accuracy, and the contemporary source closest to the events calls him the richest man in the region, with no mention of richest in the world or richest in all of history. The number everyone repeats got built up long after the fact, and the documented damage he did to Egypt's economy is the more impressive fact underneath it. Where the money came from is concrete enough to state plainly: control and taxation of the salt trade coming down from the north, and gold panned and mined at Bambouk and Bouré to the south. Timbuktu shows what that wealth built. The Sankor Mosque and school were expanded during his reign and staffed with jurists, astronomers, and mathematicians, and Musa turned Sankor from an informal school into something closer to a full university. Most of what's known about him today comes from manuscripts written in Timbuktu itself, including the Tarikh Ibn al-Mukhtar and the Tarikh al-Sudayn, and those manuscripts were written without vowel markings, so foreign names inside them can be read several different ways. Some of the uncertainty around this whole period is just uncertainty about spelling. Now, let's move to the empire that ran on horses and the postal service. The thing that held the Mongol Empire together was a postal system with a budget behind it, called the Yam. Relay stations were set up all across the empire, each one staffed by households responsible for keeping it running, with hostels along the ordinary routes and separate, faster relays reserved for high officials, and riders handed messages off to the next rider without stopping, funded by a dedicated Yam tax. The headline number is 600 miles, or about 970 kilometers, covered in 9 days in the 13th century. People remember the Mongols mostly for what they destroyed, but the system that kept the whole empire connected was infrastructure, not conquest. Baghdad in 1258 shows the other side of that empire, and it needs to be told carefully. Hulegu, a grandson of Genghis Khan, marched west with an army of over 138,000 men against a city defended by around 30,000 troops. The Mongols routed a Baghdad sortie on January 17th by flooding their opponent's camp, breached the fortifications within a couple of days, held the eastern wall by February 4th, took the caliph's surrender on February 10th, and began looting the city 3 days after that. The caliph al-Mustasim was killed, and the sources describe him dying alongside hundreds of thousands of his subjects, though the total number of people who died in the sack of Baghdad is unknown, and no honest telling of this puts a specific figure on it. The fall of Baghdad has traditionally been described as the end of the Islamic Golden Age, and it's worth saying plainly that its consequences are more uncertain than that framing suggests, because Baghdad held the House of Wisdom described earlier along with astronomical observatories, and it ran on the newly arrived technology of paper, and a historian named Justin Marosi called it the intellectual capital of the planet at the time it fell. Legnica, fought on April 9th, 1241, gets remembered as a Mongol disaster for Poland, with Duke Henry II of Silesia leading Polish and Moravian forces, along with a few knights from military orders sent by Pope Gregory IX, and losing badly. What reframes the battle is the reason it was fought in the first place. Legnica was a diversion meant to tie up Northern European forces so they couldn't reinforce Hungary, and 2 days later the Mongols won a much larger battle at Mohi. What looked like Europe's disaster was somebody else's flanking maneuver. Now, let's take a look at the crusade that never reached the Holy Land. The Fourth Crusade set out to fight in Egypt and instead attacked Zara, a Catholic city on the Adriatic coast, on November 10th and 11th, 1202, which made it the first attack on a Catholic city by a Catholic crusading army, and it happened despite Pope Innocent III explicitly telling the Crusaders not to attack fellow Christians. The people of Zara hung banners marked with crosses from their windows and walls to remind the army outside that they were Christians too, and the city fell anyway on November 24th. Some of the Crusaders wanted no part of it. A commander named Simon de Montfort led a group that refused to take part and went on to the Holy Land separately, and others simply turned around and went home, because it mattered to people at the time that what was happening was wrong. 2 years later, in 1204, the same crusade sacked Constantinople, the greatest Christian city in the world, an expedition that had been raised to fight in Egypt. The first crusade came 100 years earlier and comes with its own correction attached. The massacre that followed the capture of Jerusalem in 1099 is one of the most notorious events of the whole period, described by one source as a mix of extreme violence and anguished faith, and the same research is clear that the scale of that massacre got exaggerated in later medieval retellings. Both things are true at once. The massacre happened, and the numbers repeated afterward grew past what the sources support. And before the armies of the First Crusade ever reached the East, they carried out massacres against Jewish communities across Europe. And that's part of what happened, not a footnote to skip past for comfort. Now, let's move to the 40 days that gave us a word people still use. The word quarantine started as a number, not an idea. In 1377, the Republic of Ragusa, the city known today as Dubrovnik, imposed a 30-day isolation period on ships and travelers arriving from plague-affected areas, first tested on nearby islands, and that 30-day period was called the Trentino. It later got extended to 40 days, and 40 in Italian is quarantino, which is exactly where the English word quarantine comes from. A word people used constantly a few years ago was coined on the Dalmatian coast in the 14th century. The death toll from the Black Death itself gets reported differently depending on the source and the region, with figures of 30%, 50%, and 60% of Europe's population all showing up in different places, plus something like a third of the Middle East's population, and it's fairer to give a range than a single confident number. The plague doctor mask, the beaked leather outfit everyone pictures when they hear the word plague, was not worn during the Black Death or anywhere in the medieval period at all. It comes from a physician named Charles Delorme, who described the outfit during a plague outbreak in Paris in 1619, made of Moroccan goat leather, with boots, a long coat, a hat and gloves modeled on a soldier's canvas gown, and the beak itself was packed with dried flowers, herbs, camphor, or a vinegar-soaked sponge to filter the air. The single most recognizable medieval image in existence is more than 2 centuries too late to be medieval at all, and some scholars have even argued the costume started out as a theatrical prop that inspired the real outfit later, rather than the other way around, though that view is a minority one. Flagellants moved through plague-stricken towns during the same period, whipping themselves in public as an act of penance meant to hold off God's punishment. The economic aftermath is where this gets interesting. Labor got scarce once so many workers had died, and within a generation, England had the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. The trigger was a poll tax, the third version after 2 earlier ones in 1377, and a failed sliding scale attempt, and this final version charged a flat 12 pence on every person over the age of 15, with no discount for married couples, expected to raise something like £66,666. It was widely dodged in the southeast. Enforcement turned violent in the town of Brentwood, and the unrest spread across the region under the leadership of a man named Wat Tyler. Writers in the 17th century, including John Smythe, established the idea that this revolt marked the end of unfree labor and serfdom in England, and that reading has stuck around as the standard version ever since, even though it's an interpretation with its own history rather than a settled fact. Now, let's take a look at a 1,000-year-old recipe that beat a modern superbug. Medieval medicine ran on a system called humorism, the idea that illness came from an imbalance inside the body, and that treatment meant restoring balance, which is why bleeding a patient was a completely standard medical response. Hildegard of Bingen, a nun who lived from 1098 to 1179, wrote about healing through both prayer and the four humors at once, and her book, Causae et Curae, lays out the reasoning behind bleeding as treatment, and she believed in God and in natural physical causes at the same time, without seeing any contradiction between them, because for her period, that combination was completely ordinary. It's worth correcting the idea that the church held medicine back during this period, because the record says the opposite happened. Christianity, through the medieval period, neither set medical knowledge back nor pushed it forward on its own, but it did preserve what already existed, and monks translated Greek medical texts into Latin starting in the 6th century, reorganized old herbal manuals, added tables of contents so information could be found quickly, kept the herbs that worked, dropped the ones that had proven useless, and corrected the illustrations so plants could be properly identified. That whole cluster of work adds up to one fact: they were editing for accuracy, not just copying blindly. There's a direct line running from Baghdad to the universities covered earlier in this video. Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, written around 1030, stayed an authoritative medical text in European education well into the early modern period, alongside Al-Zahrawi's Surgical Encyclopedia, and by the early 1300s, both of those translated texts were sitting inside the medieval universities, forming the foundation of medical education across Europe. And now the payoff. Bold's Leech Book is a 10th century medical text written in Old English, surviving in a single manuscript in the British Library, put together by the same scribe who recorded a stretch of the historical annals from 925 to 955, probably at Winchester. In March of 2015, researchers reported that one recipe from the book, an eye salve made from garlic, leek, wine, and bile from a cow's stomach, left to sit in a brass container for 9 days, had been tested both in a lab dish and in living tissue, and had turned out to be as effective against MRSA as vancomycin, the modern antibiotic normally used against it. And the detail that turns this from folklore into something closer to science is that none of the ingredients worked on their own, only the full combination did, which means someone in the 10th century had landed on a specific mixture that does something none of its individual parts can do alone. The researchers behind the study explained why that shouldn't come as a shock, and put the reasoning plainly. If you cut yourself with a scythe, it was highly likely that you'd get an infection. People with constant exposure to a problem sometimes stumble onto something that works, and leeches and maggots have both made their way back into modern medical use in the 21st century. None of this means medieval medicine worked in general, because most of it didn't, and this is a specific laboratory result about one remedy against one organism, rather than a verdict on the whole field. Now let's move to the bow that deformed the men who trained on it. The best physical evidence for how the English longbow worked comes from bows recovered off the wreck of the Mary Rose, which sank at Portsmouth in 1545, ranging from about 6 feet 2 inches up to 9 feet 10 inches long. A researcher named Robert Hardy estimated their draw weights at somewhere around 150 to 160 pounds of force at a 30-inch draw, with the wider range of estimates running from 100 to 185 pounds. A modern hunting bow only needs 50 to 60 pounds of draw weight to take down almost any game animal, and that's roughly what a reasonably fit adult can manage with practice, which means these men were pulling something like 3 times that, over and over, with an effective range described as well over 300 meters. And it needs to be said clearly that the Mary Rose is a Tudor wreck, more than a century past the medieval period, so this evidence is the best there is, and it is not medieval evidence. At Crécy, on August 26, 1346, Philip VI of France went up against Edward III of England, and the disaster for the French side came down mostly to the English longbowmen and to Philip letting his own army attack before it was properly ready. 10 years later, at Poitiers in 1356, King John II of France was taken prisoner, and the captured king needs no extra decoration to land as a fact. At Agincourt in 1415, Henry V was badly outnumbered, and his reasoning about what to do with prisoners is worth stating exactly as it's recorded. Outnumbered the way he was, he did not want to lose fighting men to the job of guarding and escorting captives. That's the fact as it's given, without any need to dress it up further. Joan of Arc pushed for the coronation of Charles VII, played a central role at the Siege of Orleans, and was burned in 1431 at around 19 years old. 25 years later, Pope Calixtus III rehabilitated her, reversing the verdict inside a single generation of the same institution that had killed her. The records from that rehabilitation trial describe her being mistreated in custody, including rape attempts by an English noble, and describe guards placing men's clothing in her cell so that she was forced to wear it, which mattered because that clothing was later used as evidence against her. Now, let's take a look at 5 things that actually happened and sound made up. In January of 897, Pope Stephen VI had the corpse of his predecessor, Pope Formosus, dug up 9 months after his death, dressed in full papal robes, and put on trial in front of the papal court at the Basilica of St. John Lateran. The charges included perjury, taking the papacy illegally, and illegally holding more than one diocese at the same time. The corpse was found guilty, and Formosus's entire papacy was declared retroactively null. The trial got called the Cadaver Synod, and the context makes it easier to understand without excusing it, because between 872 and 965, 24 different men held the papacy, and putting a dead man on trial was a political weapon in a period of complete instability at the top of the church. The War of the Bucket in 1325 gets told wrong almost every time, because the popular version says Modena went to war against Bologna over a bucket stolen from a well, and that isn't how it started. War was declared because Modena had captured a Bolognese castle called Monteveglio, and the bucket only got taken afterward as a trophy, by one account. It was one episode inside a struggle between Guelph and Ghibelline factions that had already been running for 300 years, with Modena on the Ghibelline side and Bologna on the Guelph side, and Modena won the only battle of the war, fought at Zappolino. The bucket never started anything, and it just happened to get all the credit afterward. Pope Joan is the story of a woman said to have reigned as pope for 2 years, from 855 to 857, in the most common version disguised as a man and rising through the church hierarchy on ability alone, exposed only when she gave birth in the middle of a public procession. The story doesn't show up in any chronicle until the 13th century, 400 years after it supposedly happened, and it spread across Europe from there, and her existence was generally accepted as true all the way up to the 16th century, though most modern historians regard the whole thing as fiction. The fact worth keeping is that Europe believed this story for 300 years straight. The first defenestration of Prague happened in 1419, and it needs to be kept separate from the much more famous defenestration of 1618, which is not medieval at all. Throwing people out of windows was not a rare event in this period, and it carried the same weight as a lynching murder carried out by a crowd rather than by one person acting alone. A second defenestration in Prague followed in 1483 and rarely gets counted as significant next to the first one, and the English word defenestrate itself only entered the language later in reference to the 1618 event. The Feast of Fools was celebrated on the 1st of January, first in southern France and then more widely, and it involved electing a false bishop, archbishop or pope for the day, parodying church ritual, and swapping the normal order of higher and lower clergy for the duration of the celebration, with the ceremonies led by different people across the week, starting with the deacons on St. Stephen's Day, December 26th. This is the same setting the Goliards performed their satirical poetry inside earlier in this video. The surviving documentation for the Feast of Fools is thin, and what's left points to it growing out of ordinary liturgical drama rather than anything more sinister, with only a partial connection to the old Roman festival of Saturnalia. So it's worth sticking to what's documented here, instead of reaching for a more dramatic version. Now, let's move to the canon they turned down. An engineer named Orban, probably Hungarian, though some sources suggest German, first offered his services to the Byzantines, who could not raise enough money to hire him. So he left Constantinople, crossed over to Sultan Mehmed II instead, and told him his cannon could blast through walls as strong as the walls of Babylon. The cannon he built for Mehmed was named Basilica, and it could throw a 600-pound stone ball, about 270 kilograms, over a mile. It took 3 hours to reload between shots. Cannonballs were in short supply throughout the siege, and it's said to have collapsed under its own recoil after 6 weeks, though that last detail is disputed and rests on only 2 weak sources. Constantine XI had ordered a great chain stretched across the mouth of the Golden Horn to block naval access to the city, so on April 22nd, Mehmed had his engineers pave a route a little over a mile long with wood, laid greased logs across the land near the Genoese colony of Galata, and dragged 80 galleys overland around the chain and down into the Golden Horn on the far side of it, so the chain never stopped anything, because the ships that mattered never came near it. There's an ugly irony sitting inside the Ottoman army that day, because among Mehmed's forces were 1,500 Serbian cavalry that a nobleman named Duraj Branković was obligated to supply as a vassal, and just a few months earlier, Branković had personally paid for the reconstruction of Constantinople's walls. The same man funded the walls and supplied part of the army that went through them. Those walls ran for roughly 7 kilometers along the Golden Horn, with sea walls facing the Sea of Marmara, and they had held for 1,000 years, with the last army to break through them being the Fourth Crusade back in 1204. The city finally fell on May 29th, 1453, and that date is one of the standard endpoints historians use for the entire medieval period. The last fact in an hour of medieval facts is the moment people stopped calling it the Middle Ages. Now, let's wrap this up. So that's 18 stops, from a pig standing trial in a Norman courtroom, to a corpse standing trial in Rome, to a cannon that blew a hole in a wall that had stood for 1,000 years. The same civilization that put animals and dead popes on trial also invented quarantine, double-entry bookkeeping, the university, and the word algorithm, and all of it happened inside the same stretch of centuries, roughly 476 to 1453. A good number of the images people think of as medieval turn out to belong to some other century entirely. The horned helmet belongs to a 19th century opera stage, the plague doctor's mask belongs to 1619, and the version of the flat earth everybody learned in school belongs to a couple of Victorian writers with an agenda. And on the other hand, a piece of medieval medicine that nobody thought twice about for 1,000 years is sitting in a modern laboratory right now, working against a bacteria that modern medicine struggles with. Now, you gotta realize, this whole period gets flattened down into a couple of images: mud, plague, and knights in shining armor, and almost none of what survives from the period supports that flattened version. The people living through these centuries were building courts and universities and banks and postal systems the whole time, and most of what got remembered wrong about them was made up centuries after they were already gone.